And the next stop on the Purdue redemption tour is the Final Four.
Moore in motion. They get it to him. Moore in space. Burst to speed. A first down for Purdue. He's still going.
All right, guys, welcome back to Wash Boilers. So today we're going to do a little bit of a quick introduction and then kind of transition into our segment. So if you watched episode 7.5, where I did the mailbag, you'll know that we had a few audio issues. That's on me. So sorry about that. But what we're going to do this episode is redo the segments that we recorded last Monday for that one. So we'll still be able to do them. We'll still be able to get some good discussion in there. We have kind of some different paths that the football team could follow this year and what some of the results may be. And then we also have, given that Purdue's summer practice started last week and is going to continue this week, kind of a couple of questions we have for the team and some answers that we're looking to get just from these practices. So excited to get into it, and let's get started.
So before we get into our paths that the Purdue football team could take this upcoming year, I kind of wanted to go through a opponent tier list, I guess you would say, for this, just to get an idea of where we would need to be in some of these paths and essentially to gauge our success for this season. So obviously, you have your premier wins at the top, and then at the bottom, there's going to be some teams that we are expected to beat, which is not a lot, but they're going to be expected. So the first tier, starting at the bottom, is going to be what we'll coin please don't lose. And that's just going to include Indiana State. Essentially, I just don't want to see a world in which Purdue football loses to Indiana State. We haven't beaten a FBS team in however many years, and yet we just lost to an FCS one going into a season where we might not be guaranteed a win. I don't want to say how realistic it is, but what would be the immediate aftermath, do you think, if we were to lose to Indiana State?
I think losing to Indiana State, obviously, you can't fire Coach Odom week one, right? I mean, you can't do that, but I almost feel like the kind of surrounding talks would be so much that you'd almost have to kind of make a move eventually. And I mean, if you're losing to Indiana State, you're going to lose to probably Wake Forest. You're probably going to lose to UCLA and Notre Dame, obviously. You start the season 0-4 going into conference play besides UCLA. That's going to be pretty tough to come back from, and you would hate to just punt the entire year after week 4, but if you're 0-4 with a loss to an FCS team, that might be the path you follow.
Yeah, at that point, it's just Purdue has never been worse down in terms of football perspective. It's the worst it's ever been and probably will ever be. So I want to talk about that now. So in our worst pass, you don't really have to discuss that. I think we can assume that it's probably going to be a win, which is why it's in the please don't lose tier. For the next two, I'll do them together real quick because I have a question for it. The next tier above please don't lose is needed Big Ten wins, and this is Minnesota and Maryland. My thought with this is essentially these are probably our most realistic wins. They're both at home, probably teams that are on our level. I know probably Minnesota and Maryland fans don't want to be grouped with us, but realistically we are all on the same level. Then the one right above that would be competitive opponent, and that's home against Wake Forest and home against Washington. Of those four teams in those two tiers, what sticks out to you the most?
Man, I would say, given that both Minnesota and Maryland are at home this year, and you can't because of just where Purdue was the last 2 years, you almost want to put them into please don't lose category. We're talking about paths. If Purdue's losing to Minnesota and Maryland at home this year, then we're not any better than last year. Barring a huge jump from one of those teams where it's like, okay, clearly they're better than we expected going in. But if it stays the same and just kind of how you project them right now, if we're losing to those teams, it's just going to be so disappointing because it was even disappointing to lose at Minnesota last year.
Mm-hmm.
So if you have Minnesota at home and you're losing to them, that's going to be like, at some point, what do? You have to see some progress. And going into year 2 of Barry Odom era at Purdue, those are games that if you want to be a respectable program in the Big Ten, even a middling one, you have to start winning. So I would say just the fact that based on the last 2 years, of course, those games are going to have to be in the should win or whatever category. But I don't know. I think still they're teetering on if we lose those games, we still have some serious problems. And it's not Indiana State level, but we might be getting close.
You make a good point because I want to put them in the please don't lose tier because clearly if we do lose those, we have not changed at all and we're going to be essentially repeating. But we kind of haven't won a Big Ten game in 2 years, and you almost need to put it in its own category. Because, hey, we've had no problem with FCS opponents. We wiped before with those. We can win those. It's just once you get up to the Power 4 and Big Ten teams, that's when we have some issues. So I think I agree with you. Biggest thing that I would say of those 4, and I know I made the tiers, so it's a little questionable, but it's probably Washington at home is probably the most like questionable one you have in there. I have them in competitive opponent and not in the next tier, which we'll get to in a second, just because it's at home. We don't have a history with them. It feels like one of those games where, let's say we win all the ones below. I don't think a win at home against Washington is like out of the question. I just don't think that seems a crazy jump. Wake Forest makes the most sense there because they're kind of, if we look better on that same level, but I think Washington kind of has that same feeling. So if I'm going to get into the next tier here, the not expected but possible opponents, this is going to have 4 teams, which is the most. It's at UCLA, at Illinois, at Iowa, and home against Wisconsin. And so essentially all road games except for Wisconsin, who any Purdue fan knows we have a very long history with of losing for the last, I think at this point, it's about 23 years that we haven't beat them. So that's why they're in the upper tier. I think a lot of people would maybe have them a tier below, but they just, with that history, I got to have them there.
Yeah, I think Wisconsin going into this year, just given the state of their program, and I think they're switching out ADs, like there's a lot of kind of uncertainty surrounding them. And if they weren't called Wisconsin, we'd probably have them in that Maryland and Minnesota tier, like you said. So I think maybe Purdue comes out and is good enough to where at that point of the season, it's kind of almost like, actually, Wisconsin is a team that we should end up beating. And we get out to a good lead and we just don't look back. But knowing Purdue football, that's not going to happen. So yeah, I mean, I think all of those games, the one that really sticks out to me is going to be our 11 o'clock Eastern showdown with UCLA in the Rose Bowl. I think that's going to be a really interesting gauge early on because at that point, let's say, I mean, God willing, Purdue beats Indiana State. Then you have Wake Forest. If Purdue beats Wake Forest at home, there's going to start being some conversations where it's like, okay, first Power 4 win since 2023 at that point, and Purdue's clearly shown progress. This was a 9-win team last year in Wake Forest that we beat. If we go on the road and a UCLA team that has a new coach, I know they have a pretty highly rated recruiting class, but still, you never know how much impact they're going to have as freshmen. It's a team that really probably shouldn't be that much better than Purdue. If we're able to go in there and get the win, I don't know. I think Purdue 3-0 heading into that Notre Dame game, that's the kind of confidence you would want. So I have that UCLA game kind of circled where if we can come out of that with a win and we've taken care of business in week 1 and 2, we might be, if we're 3-0 going into a home game versus Notre Dame, I'm not saying we're going to win, but that's the level of confidence you need that team to come out with. Because when you look at the team against Notre Dame 2 years ago, that's when that season fell apart, is when we went into the locker room down against Notre Dame, and all reports say that was like the straw that broke the camel's back in like week 2. So if we can have that confidence, and that's so important, I feel like, and it's just a hard thing to see on the surface, if we can have that going into that Notre Dame game and stay competitive with them, even if we probably will lose, that could be a really great kind of sign for the season ahead, I think.
I feel like that's why it's almost a situation of what you say is why I have them in that not expected but possible. Because realistically, I mean, I'm not super up to date on UCLA's rankings and stuff. I just don't think they're on that level of maybe, where Illinois and Iowa have been the past couple of years. Like, so you wouldn't expect them to be this high up. But because of the situation where we would be hypothetically maybe going in 2-0 into UCLA and the amount of pressure that would be if we win this game, like this season's already above everyone's expectations. I just can't expect that to happen based on what we've seen in the past. I want it to happen more than anything, but it's in that tier for that. So the next two I'm going to do, and these are the last two, I'll do them together, is the long shot tier at Penn State alone on Halloween. That is in the long shot. And we'll get into later why we have this separated, I guess, from the other two, but Penn State's a little bit of a question mark going into this year. They could easily move up into the top tier, but by the middle of the season, they might move down to the not expected but possible tier, depending on how the new coach looks. They're losing pretty much one of their, I think, best coaches they've ever had in their program's history. They're losing a lot of players that transferred. They're losing commitments and stuff. So it's an interesting one where this could go either way, where it's by Halloween we're like, yeah, there's no chance this is happening, or we're watching this game and we're like, all right, we have a good chance of winning at this. And then for our last year, we have spoiler makers. Bringing back the spoiler makers topic, I guess, is it would be Notre Dame at home and then at IU. And so these are games where, as much as I hate to say it, we will not be expected to win. I don't think we'll probably be minus however many points against them. They'll be favorited heavy over us, and it's hard to imagine a world in which we, I guess, pull these games off.
Yeah, you look at the Notre Dame game, and Notre Dame might be the odds-on favorite to win the national championship right now. So we might be going into that game, and Notre Dame might be the number one team in the country. We might be going into a situation in Bloomington in the final week of the season where they're playing for a Big Ten championship game appearance. And if they're playing for one of those, realistically, they're probably even ranked within like the top three. Because knowing the Big Ten and kind of their schedule next year, like they have to play at Ohio State. So if they're coming out of there and they're still like pretty solid late in the season, they're going to be pretty highly ranked too. So it's yeah, it's going to be a long shot no matter what. But going to the actual like long shot category versus Penn State, I don't know. Maybe I'm too high on James Franklin and maybe I'm too delusional about Purdue, and it's probably a mix of both, but I really think Purdue could have a shot in that game. We've talked about this before, but the fact that it's on Halloween, that means something. I'm sorry, it just means something. And I feel like, can you see the ESPN Bleacher Report graphic of like the spoiler makers on Halloween? I can kind of see it. And I feel like if you can see that graphic, then you can believe it. So I know, like, looking at the past 2 years of Purdue football has led us to where our analysis of the game is imagine a hypothetical graphic being made about a Purdue team pulling an upset on the holiday. But I actually do think that Penn State game, while it is a long shot and we probably won't win, I don't know. I could see that being, and I'll save this, I guess, for when we get into like the best possible path maybe for Purdue. That's a win that I think if Purdue was able to get this year, that's something you hang your hat on going into the future, and maybe you have a brighter outlook on 2027 than you might otherwise.
I completely agree with you for the sense that I can see it happen. There is a path which we'll get into later with the probably the best path, I guess, where we would realistically beat Penn State. But that becomes, Barry Odom's signature win at Purdue since he's been here. It's huge, like just culture change. Like we've been a laughing stock, at least last year. People are like the worst Power 4 team by far. You go in and beat Penn State, none of that matters anymore. Literally, it's completely different team. Everybody's back in. Barry Odom is propped up as like a new guy in the Big Ten, is like able to rebuild a program, which is what he wants. I mean, that's where he wants to be at. So I think it's a great thing to talk about in the future, and it's a great thing to like hope for a team. But to get us onto our actual, I guess, kind of paths that we want to look at, we'll sadly start with the worst path first, essentially what that would look at for Purdue, which we have kind of experienced the last 2 years. Essentially, my thought with this is it would be a win against Indiana State, because I don't want to think of a world where we lose to them, and then one of Minnesota, Maryland. Essentially, you go 2-10. You're basically just repeating another year of being, Purdue football for the last 2 years, and it's like, what is going on? Like, essentially at that point, Ryan Brown probably hasn't improved at all. The offense is going to look stagnant. Indiana's probably going to have another great season. They're going to blow us out again. Going to get blown out by Notre Dame as well. Then, Barry Odom's likely to be fired after. I don't think you can go another season of that questionable or that bad, honestly, if anything, and stay in the Big Ten. And it's kind of a question of who would even want to come to Purdue at that point. You're going to get your ass beat by 3 different teams every year because you play a mix of Ohio State, Michigan, Notre Dame, and IU every year. So it just becomes a truly dark time for the program at that point.
Yeah, I agree. I think that 2-10 path has to be it. And I don't know. I think that the unfortunate thing, like you've mentioned about Purdue, football the last couple of years, is that, yeah, one Big Ten win actually is an improvement over where we are. But what you also have to look at is if Purdue goes 2-10 and we have a new athletic director coming in and the only improvement is that we won one Big Ten game instead of 0, I just feel that mix of scenarios, Coach Odom would get fired. And
yeah,
unfortunately, that'd be the second time in a row where you have a coach that only lasts 2 years. And at that point, the stability of the program, you would have the one kind of life raft you would have from that is that factor of the new athletic director, where you could make the argument they want their guy. And Babinski, Odom was Babinski's guy. Now this new athletic director is going to be able to make his hire, and then we're going to judge him based on that. And it's not where you want to be, but unfortunately, I could see that being where the program could talk itself into. And I don't want that to happen like so badly, but I think it is unfortunately kind of a realistic possibility. And I'm going to say this, and I don't want to scare anyone, but unfortunately, say the worst path happens. Purdue is dancing really close to some pretty bad company here in really college football history and Big Ten history. So I want to bring up our friends from up north, the Northwestern Wildcats. So here's some late 70s, early 80s stuff. So Purdue, to set it up, we've lost, I guess, 18 straight Big Ten games. And if we go winless in the Big Ten again, that's going to be 27 Big Ten losses in a row. Now you look at Northwestern, and we'll start on November 19th, 1977. So Northwestern, in the final game of that year, they beat Illinois 21-7. Then after that, they go into the first game of the next season, and that's September 9th, 78. They tie Illinois 0-0. So you have a Big Ten win and then a Big Ten tie. After that, they would get another Big Ten win on October 9th, 1982 against Minnesota. They went over 4 years without a Big Ten win. And that's 38 consecutive Big Ten losses back then. So I'm not saying that Purdue is going to do that. That would be 2.5 more years of this kind of stuff. But I mean, 18 straight Big Ten losses is really bad. And if you go winless again this year and you're sitting at 27, and it will have been over 3 calendar years since your last Big Ten win, I mean, it's already over 2 right now, and that's unacceptable. Even for a program where Purdue is not historically dominant, but we are not historically this bad. And there cannot be a reality where Purdue goes 27 games. And then you look into next season, depending on how our schedule shapes up, maybe approaching 30 games in the Big Ten without a win. That is a level of ineptitude that truly would be historical. And especially you look at Northwestern in the late 70s, early 80s in college football, just a fully different sport back then with recruiting. Now with the portal and the fact that Purdue as a program could essentially rob the group of 5 of all of their top talent if they were able to put in the resources of it. And we've seen teams do that. If Purdue wasn't able to do that and get a win or build their roster in a way that could be competitive in the Big Ten or even the Power 4, there would be some very uncomfortable conversations that would have to start happening. And the program just in general, especially with football being the moneymaker that it is, I would be very concerned for Purdue's future. So I don't think that's going to happen, but we're not as far away as you might think, unfortunately.
Yeah, I mean, I think the thing that's interesting about it is obviously 18 to 38, consecutive losses is a huge difference. And we both still don't think they'll obviously get there. I think for us, it's so compounded by the fact that IU is having this run. And it feels as if like you can multiply those 18 losses by like 10. It just feels like we're in this pit that we can't get out of because somehow our in-state rival who we've owned our whole lives at this point are somehow winning national championships, which was never thought possible. So this is hopefully Dark Ages of Purdue. Hopefully this is the season that gets turned around. Barry Odom, I have a lot of faith in, especially the last couple of weeks. He's been making a lot of progress with the recruits and stuff. It seems like I want to hope that he's going to stay here because clearly he's able to get some recruits. I don't want this to be a season where we are so bad that they can't even, lean on his recruiting to keep him. So I'm glad we're getting the worst out of the way before we go into our middling and best path. And even then, our middling path is going to be so much better than, some of the other stuff we've seen the past couple of years. So I think it's good to get past that. If we're going to jump into the middling path section at this point, what I think that looks like is probably wins over Indiana State. Then you include the both Minnesota and Maryland games at home. And at that point, I say you have to get either both competitive opponent tiers or a win from one of the higher tiers. So essentially going 5, and if I can do math, 5-7 or 4-8, which is not great, but you have at least one win where you're like, that's a good win. Like that is probably the best win. That is easily the best win we've had in 3 years at that point, and then maybe the best one we've had in a while. So that's where I would say it probably goes. I'd say I don't think it ends up in a bowl game because a bowl game for this program, if you told me if we're getting a bowl game this year, that's all I need. That's in the best path by far to me. So what do you think you can interchange there to make it essentially a middling path where you're happy, but you aren't exactly beaming with pride?
I would say the bare minimum for the middling path for Purdue this year is you go into a game that you don't think you're going to win, and then you win. And you check the final score and it's like, oh, I didn't think Purdue was going to win that one. So I think that's probably the bare minimum there. And yeah, I think the middling path is probably, and I don't like to hear this as a Purdue fan, and I'm sure other Purdue fans don't like to hear it. The middling path is probably like 4-8. And that sounds awful, but it's probably 4-8. It's probably 3-6 in the Big Ten, maybe 2-7. But that's the kind of steps you have to make to at least prove that Purdue is competitive again and can win Big Ten games. Like, that is the middling path for this program, where maybe you pull off a win where you're like, oh, wow, last year we definitely would have lost that. So you can definitely see progress, and you can see that you're a program that isn't just going to be a historic doormat for the conference. But at the same time, you're probably not making a bowl game. You're probably not going to the levels that we've seen other teams be able to turn around super quickly. And I think we expect that for Purdue, just based on, well, if they can do it, then we can do it. But for every IU, there's a million other cases where schools are just still taking years to rebuild. And it sucks and you got to wait, but you got to take the small wins. And I think a middling season would just be full of small wins that maybe a couple years later you look back on and you're like, oh, wow, those ended up really proving something for us. But in the moment, they just feel like, wow, we beat Maryland at home. That's incredible. Who cares? So I think that's kind of where you're going to see the middling path.
This is something, I think you kind of said it, and I'm going to go into it deeper, but it's something I don't want to say as a Purdue fan, but it is the way I think we have to think right now, where I think a bowl win at the end of a season is the ideal Purdue season as of right now. That is kind of all you can really hope for. You cannot hope for a national championship in the next, I would say, 2 or 3 years. I just think that's an unrealistic expectation that you're only going to be setting yourself up for failure. You know, if we were IU fans and we were doing this pass and we were looking at a middling path, for them, that's losing in the first round of the playoffs, maybe. I mean, that's kind of where they're at. For us, I agree. A middling path is 4 wins, and that's better than anything we've seen the past couple years. I want to be able to go out and watch a Purdue game and be happy at the end result. That is where I think the middling path even has some upside to it. And it's almost like it's not a great thing because of the way we've had to get here, but it's a good thing in the sense that you can go into the season, win 4 games, and I'd probably still be like, I like Barry Odom. Like, we're turning this around. Like, I think it's a great spot to be in if it happens. And that's what we're hoping for, obviously. And so building on that optimism, I want to go into the best path. And essentially, I kind of touched on it. I think this has to require a bowl game appearance. I don't want to say a win because a bowl game appearance in itself is a good thing, but I will say we can't get blown out. If we go into a bowl game and we lose by like 40, that might move me down to the middling tiers because it's such a bad way to end the season, you know? But this essentially requires wins over all the other teams you mentioned before. And I want to say this is going to require a win because there's only 5 teams in the lower tiers. You're going to have to get a win over UCLA, Illinois, Iowa, Wisconsin, or maybe get one of those signature wins. Let's see a Barry Odom signature win at Purdue. And I say that puts us in that, best category.
I think you look at Purdue and the bar is so low for what would be a signature win at this point. I think a signature win, probably the most realistic one next year, is Wisconsin. And it's probably going to be against a 3-9, 4-8 Wisconsin team. But we're going to be able to point back in it and say, hey, Barry finally broke the 23-year losing streak against Wisconsin. So I think, yeah, the bar is so unbelievably low. And I do think Coach Odom can clear it with this team. Obviously, they're on a mission. # on a mission 2026.
On a mission.
So let's hope they succeed. But I think your best case scenario, you're winning the games you need to. You get one of those kind of could go either way games, probably against Wisconsin. I think another really strong win we could potentially have would be Washington at home, just because that has the Ryan Walters revenge factor. And if you were able to blow out a Ryan Walters defense at home, I feel like people would be able to look at that and say, we're slamming the door on that era. So, like, let's say we win all of the games we need to, and then we beat Wisconsin and we beat Washington at home. I think that's a realistic best case scenario, because at that point we're a bowl team, and probably not a great one, but at least we get to go to one. And we've had wins where you can say Purdue in the last 2 or 3 years are not winning those games. We've exercised 2 demons in the same season with Wisconsin and Ryan Walters, and you can take something going into 2027 and prove that you're competent. So that's where I think our best case scenario lies.
I'm glad you bring up Ryan Walters because it brings up an interesting question that I have, because you essentially look back at the last 2 years and be like, so this was like all Ryan Walters' fault. I think he becomes one of the biggest villains of the 2020s, essentially, for Purdue. And it's crazy to say that about a former head coach, but at that point, it's like, what did he do to this program? Like, if we can get Barry Odom to turn it around, and we're already in a bowl game by the end of this year, it is a huge, like, I want 30 for 30 on what he did when he was at Purdue to get us into that era. Because, hey, man, we were at Purdue, and we were going to a Big Ten championship. Then for 3 years just became nothing, and yet now we're back to bowl games. What was going on in that era?
Well, it's like it's almost where, like, when I did the mailbag, it was kind of like a Purdue sanity check that I needed to even do for myself, because I've forgotten what it's like for Purdue to be a competent Big Ten team and go into a game and I'm like, yeah, we should beat Maryland, we should beat Rutgers, we should beat all these other teams. I haven't felt that in years, and even during the Braun era, you'd have the big upsets, which would make you believe, and then we'd lose to a middling Wisconsin team, of course, or we'd lose to some other team. So it's like, even those teams never finished a season ranked, but they were at minimum competent. So I think that literally, I mean, and it all just circles back to the bar being so low, to where if we can just prove that we're competent, if we can prove that we can win Big Ten games again, and that the Ryan Walters era was more of an aberration than reality, it would be great. I want to be talking a year from now about maybe we can make the first round of the playoff, or maybe we can be a top 6 Big Ten team. But for right now, if we can just get those baby steps, that would be perfect.
I would love to be able to experience a thing where it's like, what are we going to finish the season ranked? That would be an amazing thing to like be able to talk about as a Purdue fan. And as basketball, we get so much of that. I just want football to be able to enjoy that too. But I have a really great question here to end this segment, because I think it's a test of how much you hate your rival to an extent. And I think Purdue is one of those teams where you hate them more than anything. I think they're one of the biggest schools for that. So let me set up a situation for you. We go into the season, we beat Indiana State, where it's an expected win, but you have a good feeling. We then proceed to go the rest of the season up until the IU game winless. We, get blown out a couple times by Notre Dame, probably at Penn State. But then on the day after Thanksgiving, or either on Thanksgiving, I think this is at IU this year. We go into Bloomington, IU's ranked number 1, and we win. How successful do you feel after that game?
That's one where you record the podcast immediately after, and it is, we are back. Coach Odom is the guy. Like, we're set, we're ready to go. And then you almost have to record one the day after where you have a reality check, and you're like, man, we just were flirting with another winless Big Ten season, and then we pulled something out of our ass at the end. Is it successful because I hate IU? Absolutely. That is a successful season, especially if it's a game that like matters to them and we actually get a win and it costs them a spot in the playoff or something. Yes, as a pure IU hater, that is the best thing I could ask for. But as a fan of Purdue, that would be such a failure of a season that, yeah, we're just resetting, and the new AD is probably going to have to pick a new coach, and we're going to have to reset this cycle again. And then 2027 is going to be it's their first year type of year. And then 2028, we'll be having these same conversations again in the offseason. So hopefully that doesn't happen. I would take a 5-7, 6-6 season where we lose to IU at the end, but we show progress to where eventually we'll be a strong enough program to compete with them. I would fully take that over that scenario, but man, if the first 3 hours after that game would not be some of the best just Purdue football moments of all time.
I think it is the most euphoric feeling probably that would ever happen for a Purdue fan, besides winning a national championship, is, beating such a great IU team and, having that stain, just being like, I'm sure it's how IU fans felt to an extent when, I think it was the year we went to the national championship, or maybe it was the year before, when they beat us twice in the regular season. I'm sure that's a little bit of how they felt, and I would love to have that feeling. But that IU team also didn't then lose every other game that season to not FCS teams. It would be the next day you wake up and you're like, my man, like, wow, we could have won some other games. Like, what happened? Like, it would be such a sobering week as you go on. You're like, all right, well, so kind of It's very open, really, the answer. I don't know. It would be such a hard thing to deal with, but like we said, most euphoric 24 hours of our lives. So I think it's a great thing. I also keep bringing this up whenever we get the chance, just to start manifesting an IU win. But we also manifest the fact that we win a couple other games during the season. So that's gonna be into that segment, and then we'll be right back, and we'll get back with some Purdue basketball questions as summer ball has been going on for the past week.
All right, so in this next segment, we're going to be going through some questions that we have as Purdue starts summer ball and just kind of seeing if we can get some answers. So the first one I'll kind of start us off with is kind of centered around Caden Pierce. And we obviously know he's transferring in from Princeton, obviously a smaller conference, but truly, what is his role on the team going to be? Is he going to be closer to maybe a Lance Jones or Oscar Clough type of role where he's an immediate impact transfer? Is he going to be closer to maybe, I'm not saying he's going to be this player, but someone like a Dalton Connect who transfers in and is automatically the best player on his team? Is he going to be closer, maybe more so to Murphy, where he doesn't make more of an impact, but is slightly better? So just kind of curious, what's Caden Pierce's role? Is he going to be starting? Is he even guaranteed a starting spot if he's not a starter? What does that look like? But just kind of curious, where do you think Caden Pierce projects for this next year? And what do you think his role on the team is going to be?
I think this is probably there. We have 5 good questions, so I don't want to say this is the biggest question I have going into the season, but it is the one where it's because he is the sole transfer coming in. And I know we have recruits coming in who haven't played. We have, Antoine West, who, hasn't started or played before, but because of the difference in where he could end up being, a guy who's the number 1 scorer on the team versus he could also be a guy who maybe just doesn't even get a lot of playing time. I think that's such an interesting thing. For me, I want to believe he's going to be an impact starter. And the reason I think that, he had I have some stats actually that I'll read off because I have for later. He averaged 16 points and 9 rebounds his sophomore season on 55% shooting when he was in the Ivy League. And so it is the Ivy League. Obviously, it's not the Big Ten. There's a big difference there. But, you bring in anything like that to this team that is definitely going to need some of that with let's say the projected starting lineup looks something like Omer, Cox, whoever at the 3, Pierce, and Jacobson. There's an expectation there that someone on that team is going to have to do scoring besides Cox to an extent. Omer's going to be a scorer. We need rebounding besides Jacobson. That's a huge thing for the team. There's so many different ways you can go. I just want to believe that we know to an extent when we go get a guy what they're going to be on the team. I think it's kind of worked out the past couple of seasons. You did a really good segment on the mailbag about how good we've been with our transfers, essentially with Oscar Clough coming in, starting, and he was probably the second best player on the team late in the year. And then Lance Jones before that being a huge integral part to that run. I just feel like if I have to believe in Purdue, I have to believe that he's probably going to be maybe the number 2 or 3 guy on the team next year besides Cox.
No, I agree. And I think if you're starting Caden Pierce, we're already going to be a small starting lineup. So you have to hope that, and a lot of the talk has been that he rebounds a lot better than his size. So if we're starting him at the 4 and he's maybe at best 6'7", he's going to need to provide maybe something else if that rebounding isn't to the level that we think it is. And then we're probably looking at a team that's going to struggle defensively, at least against some matchups, again, as we go into next season. So if you're trying to just make a prediction and the only thing you had to do was say, gun to your head, is he going to start or is he not going to start? I almost wonder, and I know Purdue doesn't promise guys and you have to earn your spot, and I get it, but you almost wonder if the other teams who were recruiting him, like a Duke or a UConn, maybe the reason he chose Purdue was because he thought he could have a larger role. And maybe Purdue just outright beat UConn and Duke in recruiting. And I want to believe that. And I think that would be awesome and a great state for the program if we're beating out blue bloods for transfers and hopefully eventually recruits. But it almost makes me think that maybe he looked at Purdue and said, maybe my last year can still be at a high level program, but it's not to the point where Duke and UConn, really with the guys that they have coming in, who knows if you're going to be even a starter at those schools. Meanwhile, Purdue, probably a better chance there to make an impact. So I almost think that choosing Purdue leads me to believe that he's probably going to start and his role is probably going to be larger than we even might think it might be.
And that's the thing, is that it's probably not the worst thing if that was to happen. Like we want to say, I guess, yeah, you don't think we're promising minutes at all, and I don't think we would. I think Matt Perry's the type of guy where he'll tell you, you got to fight for every minute you're going to get on the team. Clearly, has caused friction in the past with someone like Cannon Catchings or something. So there is a way where I believe that he knows he's got to fight for his minutes. Obviously, he has an Indy connection because his brother is Alex Pierce, who's on the Colts. So, maybe that partially play into it. It is very impressive to choose Purdue over Duke and UConn, who, like you say, you might have to fight more for against guys who might be harder to beat for their spots than at Purdue, but it's still a huge accomplishment for Purdue to get him, and I think it's a good sign. I think moving on to the next question then, kind of building on a new team this year, are we going to see something like a new system? So essentially, we've had 4 straight years of Braden Smith being the guy who's leading this team, controlling the offense. He brings the ball up every time. And it's really, I wouldn't ever say it's a hindrance because it's been the most successful we've ever been. But he's been that guy. That has been the system, and it has not really, I would say, meaningfully shifted. Are we going to see a new kind of Purdue system? We have a bunch of guards. We have Omer and Ertl. Are we expecting that they're just going to recreate that, with Omer and Ertl? Maybe, it's split. I don't want to say 2020, but, Omer is a starter, Ertl's off the bench, and then there's just the new Braden Smiths in each group. Or are we going to see something where, we have multiple ball handlers? I fully believe a guy like Cox can bring up the ball just as well as Omer and Ertl. He's not the same playmaker, obviously, but he's a better scorer. Maybe we need that. And so I'm interested to see, do you think it's more likely we kind of just, I don't want to say run it back, but repeat that Braden Smith style, or we see something new?
I think we're going to see something new because I just don't think we have, to your point, the talent of a Braden Smith on this team yet. Now, maybe one day one of these guys is going to get there, like an Ertl, or maybe Omer is just kind of ready to step into that role. But I think especially at the start of the season, we're going to see a lot of different rotations. I think maybe some of our lineups might make it on the court. That'd be kind of cool. But I would say really just in terms of everything with that, I don't know. I think it has to be different because you look at last year's team and there were 3 guys who you basically had to give 30 minutes a game. And just based on their seniority and just the level of player that they were, you have to play Braden Fletcher and TKR 30 minutes a game in order to have as much success as you possibly can. Now you really don't have those guys on the team. CJ Cox obviously is the closest probably to deserving those minutes. Again, Caden Pierce is a high-level transfer, probably is going to get a lot of minutes, but I don't know. I could see a thing where Purdue's strength this year really is that depth, and we just have a bunch of constantly rotating guard rotations. Jacobson, I guess, probably plays most of the minutes at the 5, and we'll kind of get to that later with maybe that position. But yeah, I think that Purdue this year is just going to be kind of a wave of guards, and maybe we'll see more pressure on ball. Maybe we'll see different types of things that you can ask guys to do when you're not also asking them to play 35 minutes and score most of your points. So maybe there'll be some more kind of burst type of game planning where you don't have to rely on a guy for 40 minutes a game. So I think it could be interesting. I'm sure there's going to be some advantages to it, but then again, it's always better to have a guy you want to play 35 minutes a game than it is to not have a guy you want to play that. So I don't know. I think it'll kind of go both ways, but I do definitely think it's not just going to be a rinse and repeat system as it has been really the last 2 or 3 years.
I'll say a quick thing before I let you get to your next question. I do think we are in good hands with this to an extent. So we have PJ Thompson as the assistant coach, and since he's been there, we've seen the offense, I think, being the top 10 in efficiency the last 3 years. So I don't think he's a guy he was lucky Braden Smith was here at the same time, and that's why he got in Zach Edey. That's why he was able to have such great offenses. I think he's going to be able to make, meaningful adjustments and changes that are going to happen. So I think we'll be in good hands. I am curious to see what the new system's going to look like.
Yeah, no, I agree. Kind of transitioning, building off of that, my next question is, we're assuming Daniel Jacobson is going to be the starting center. He's the most veteran guy on the team. He's obviously the tallest guy on the team who's played the most minutes at that position in the past. But besides him, he can't play all 40 minutes. Who's going to fill that backup 5 role? Is Sinan Wan going to be ready as a freshman who a lot of people are saying he's going to be very good, but maybe right now he just isn't as good and he doesn't know how good he's going to be if we're going off his quote. But then I guess kind of going off of that, Raleigh Burgess, maybe projected more as a 4, but is he going to fill most of those backup 5 minutes? So I think that right now, when you look at Purdue's roster, if you were expecting them to make any other additions, it would probably be at the 5. And I'll mention this guy now. Apparently, Purdue is going to get another player from France when they finish up the playoffs or whatever they have over there for the league that he's in, Enzo Chavrin. but he's only 6'6".
Yeah, he's
So
not over that at
yeah,
all.
I've heard him compared to Mason Gillis, but without a jump shot. So I'm not sure what that is, but it seems like
Awesome.
he's going to be more of a 4. So I don't think he's going to get minutes at the 5. So I guess if I had to say who I would think it would be, probably Raleigh Burgess, just because I don't think Sananwan's going to be ready. And Burgess is 6'11". I mean, that's the same height Clough was, but Clough is probably a little bit sturdier than Burgess. Burgess almost projects more as not a wing, but more of like a stretch 4. So I don't know. I'm definitely very curious about who that's going to be, because we're going to have to figure that out early, especially if Jacobson doesn't immediately take the leap that we're probably going to need him to.
I know I said Caden Pierce's role on the team is like my biggest question. I think who the backup 5 or how the bigs are going to work this season is my favorite question, because I think it's such an interesting, like, if you go and look at the roster right now, essentially we have over 6'8". So Rivers Knight is 6'8". He's a freshman. I think if there was redshirting, he would probably redshirt. So realistically, we can't expect anything out of him. Then you have Sam King, who's walk-on. And then you have Burgess, 6'11", Sanan, 7'1", Jacobson, 7'4". That's 3 guys over 6'11". I mean, and then, like I said, 5 guys over 6'8", and 2 of them aren't expected to do much. I think it's such an interesting, like, question, because I've seen a lot of stuff recently about Burgess being a 4. I almost think we can't afford to have him be the 4. Like, I really want that. I think it'd be such a cool thing to see Burgess and Jacobson on the court at the same time. But then what do you do when, one of them gets into foul trouble? You have Sanan. I mean, I like Sanan, and maybe they just really believe he can come out there and, be the guy and, play real minutes in the Big Ten. But if we're being realistic about a freshman coming in who doesn't know how good he is yet, I don't know if I can really see that happening. I think we almost are forced to essentially have Burgess be the backup 5. And at that point, you have probably Pierce sliding into the 4. I think there's a lot of talk right now about how different this team could be as in terms of size. I almost just don't think we have the roster for it to an extent if certain things don't work out.
You look at the Arizona game last year, and obviously this was because we just needed size, and it just got to a point where we were screwed without it. But when we rolled out for the first time the Jacobson Clough lineup, and you slid Clough to the 4 and Jacobson to the 5, can we do that again this year? Because we're going to have matchups, undoubtedly, where it presents similar issues, and we actually probably are a larger team overall than last year, just because our point guard's not 5'11" anymore, and we just have a little bit more height there. But really, it's not like it's a huge strength for us, so we're going to have to find a way to build that out. So I guess you're going to have to see lineups. Let's say we need to have a game where the lineup has to be Burgess at the 4 and Jacobson at the 5, just for size reasons. Does one of them just have to stay on the court at all times?
I think one is playing 40 minutes.
There? Exactly.
Yeah.
I mean, I guess you would have to say that you could maybe have Enzo, because apparently he's a really good rebounder. He's really strong. He's older. He's like 23. I guess you could say he could fill in at the 5 just in terms of just like being a body in the paint. But I don't know. I think that is a very interesting question that I honestly don't even think we're going to get an answer to maybe until December and January, because besides Gonzaga, obviously we have the early season tournament, but we're not going to really be getting into play against teams that can really test that until we get into conference play. And I don't know, it's going to be really interesting to see, like, maybe someone starts catching on versus some of the group of 5 teams that we're going to be playing. But I think that is a huge question going into next season.
I think my biggest thing would be if you see a line, if we start the season and Burgess and Jacobson are both starting, and that is the starting lineup, Sanan is going to be really good. Like, they have so much faith in him at that point, because they're essentially risking, if Burgess, gets any fouls, it's basically just Sanan and Jacobson at that point, or vice versa with, Jacobson gets into foul trouble, and then you're essentially just sliding over. That would be a huge thing. I would say if that lineup happens, you almost have to expect Sanan's just like, I would bet all my money that he's going to be insane dude this season. So it's a huge question. I mean, I think it's really interesting because I almost feel like people aren't looking. I know people know the roster, but when you really look at it, it's like, what are we going to do? So interesting question. I'll move on to my last one. And I think it's a really interesting way to think if you're hopefully optimistic about Purdue like us. And so essentially, since 2020, we've had Ivy, Edie, and Braden all being leaders on the team. Essentially, nobody saw any of them coming. Like, Ivy didn't even start until later in the season his freshman year. Edie, nobody expected to be 2-time player of the year, probably the best college basketball player of all time. And then Braden going into his junior year, I think a lot of people thought we weren't even going to be good. I think everybody thought it was going to be a down year essentially. So nobody saw them coming. My thing this year is if we're going to trust the system, be optimistic, there is someone on this squad who's going to be the next guy. Who that is, I think I have down 3 choices here. I think, you can make a case for a couple other guys, but the first obvious pick I have would be CJ Cox. Essentially, he kind of takes over that role of being the most experienced dude. He comes in and he's just a scorer. He basically changes how we as a roster work, where you have scoring first. It's almost back to the Edwards days, I would say, because he's not as tall as Ivy at all. He's not as, I want to say, like, bouncy the same way. So you're essentially having a guy come in late in his career, turn it on, and be the guy. He would need to be, one of the top scorers in the Big Ten. It would be just a huge change for him. And I think it's the obvious one, but it's the one I almost had the least amount of faith in, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree. Because I think most people are, he's the only returning starter. So that's just the obvious kind of lead in there where it's going to be like, well, yeah, he played the most minutes of anyone coming back, and so he's going to be that guy. The other returning guys with Jacobson has a bunch of question marks just because last year wasn't the greatest for him. And then same with Jakari. Obviously in the rotation, but hasn't proven himself to the level that CJ has, and Pierce transfers are always unknown. So I definitely could see a reality where we're coming out of the season and CJ Cox is a high-level Big Ten starter, and I think he already is that. But with Purdue, and obviously this is the first time this has happened really in Purdue history, and it's really, you look at across the country, Purdue's had a first-team All-American 4 years in a row. We've had an All-American 5 or 6 years in a row going back to Ivy. So really, this is an unprecedented stretch for Purdue. And Purdue's obviously had success without that All-American level of guy. But if we're used right now to this team being centered around that one guy, and this kind of goes back to your system point, I think going into this year, while I do believe he can be a productive player and he'll be really good, I have less faith probably that CJ might be that guy as I did in Braden or like a Zach Edey or an Ivy.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think so. That's why I'll get into these other 2 guys. So the other guy that I think would make a lot of sense for this is Omer Meyer. And you brought this up at a really good point. If he was transferring in, how we would feel about him. And essentially, the narrative with him would be he was behind the best point guard probably of all time in college basketball. Of course, he's going to come in and now he's going to be the guy, and he's going to be exactly what we've been looking for as a scoring point guard who can also be a huge playmaker. I wouldn't say he's my pick, but I think he's one where if you really were to look at the roster and be like, where was this guy behind? Why wasn't he showing as much last year? It's so obvious with Omer Meyer because he's behind the best college point guard of all time. It's hard to imagine a world where that doesn't free him up for a lot more responsibility and ability to score. He had talk of being a first-round pick last year. There's no reason that narrative can't come back. So how much improvement do you perceive Omer Meyer's going to have this year?
I think Omer, it's hard because, and this isn't one of our questions, but it's almost like another good question is who's going to start at point guard? Because you have an Indiana Mr. Basketball coming in who's very good, is winning All-Star game MVP in the Indiana-Kentucky game. That's going to be hard to beat out for anyone, even with Omer's background playing professionally overseas. It's not going to be super easy for him to just come in and steal that starting role. Now, I think he is going to be the starter, but at that same time, Omer almost, and I've heard a lot of analysis on him where we expect him to step into that point guard role, and we're used to a guy having a bunch of assists. The most assists in NCAA history, actually. Apparently, Omer is probably more of a guy just based on his success over in Israel and when he's played professionally he needs to like kind of get more into a rhythm with his jump shot. So he might be more of even like a scorer first, to where I could see a reality where at the end of the season, we're looking back and maybe Omer's averaged 18 and 6, and we're like, okay, that kind of makes sense, and he's our go-to guy. So I could see Omer definitely being that kind of player, and it wouldn't shock me if he, at the end of this year, we were looking at him, and maybe it's less of like, who's the next Braden Smith, and maybe he's more of a, this guy maybe fits more into that 2 role, and he's kind of a Carson Edwards archetype almost, where he can go off, he can still play make, and he's technically a point guard, but he's more of a scorer combo guard type.
I guess the part that sucks the most is I almost think an ideal lineup would be is if you could somehow play Ertl, Cox, and Meyer at the same time. But it's just they're just too small, I think, for it to probably work. But man, that would be insane, like levels of being able to play make while also getting scoring. Because I think all three of those guys are going to be like really good at, I mean, really just walking buckets essentially. So it's an interesting question to have. I agree. That maybe is going to be a next question in the future is who's going to be the point guard. But for my last guy, this is the one where I almost want to plant my flag in it early, but I'm thinking I'm going to save it for a while. But he's the one where to be the most nowhere guy. It's not happened to Purdue really since the way we run it with Matt Painter and our system. But if Caden Pierce was to come in and be that guy, if he came in and essentially just, he's like, all right, this is my team. And, he's starting. He obviously have to start in this instance, but he's primary scorer, he's rebounding, the best like out of the forwards or whoever he starts with, and he's essentially just the engine for our team. You have Cox and whoever's the point guard, being really good scorers, but it's Pierce leading that whole, he's basically adult to connect to this team. So it'd be interesting to see if that can happen because it's so un-Purdue like.
If we look at how Purdue teams have operated in the past, Lance Jones wasn't coming into a team where he was expected to be the leading scorer. It was obvious Edey was going to be the leading scorer on that team. Oscar Clough, we knew, wasn't going to come in and be Purdue's focal point. It was going to be Braden Smith and TKR. With Caden Pierce, again, like we mentioned earlier, with CJ Cox not being to that level of an Edey or a Braden Smith where we're expecting, this is 100% going to be his team. I think Caden Pierce has the best chance of anyone of coming in and being that first kind of transfer to lead Purdue. And maybe in this transfer portal era, that just kind of Purdue is finally adapts it. And this is just Purdue's year to do it. And it becomes the Caden Pierce year. And then we're adjusting afterwards. But yeah, I could definitely see Caden being that kind of guy.
I almost want to say it's what would make the most sense is if I told you at the end of this year, we went into the tournament and we had a really good year. We got knocked out in like the Elite Eight or somehow we made the Final Four and we lost. I think it almost makes the most sense if I was to tell you, yeah, Caden Pierce was just like our best player and like took over and was essentially just led us there. Because if I tell you CJ Cox is our best player, I don't think your expectation is Final Four appearance. I don't think if I told you Omer Meyer is Final Four appearance. If I told you Caden Pierce, you're either like, oh, wow, something bad happened or something really good happened. You know what I mean? Because I always think it could go both ways. Now that I say it, I always think if I told you Caden Pierce, you're like, what happened to CJ Cox and those other guys? I mean, my head don't connect is like, this insane dude who's like, super tall or something. He's only 6'6". I mean, Caden Pierce is taller than him, has like averaged great points and rebounds in the Ivy League. It's definitely a realistic thing that, in my opinion, could happen.
Dalton Knecht came from the Big Sky Conference. Is the Big Sky Conference that much better than the Ivy League at all? I mean, yeah, and again, Dalton Knecht ended up being almost a lottery pick, and if Zach Edey didn't exist, he would have been the National Player of the Year. That is not an expectation that you can realistically give to anyone in the country, and it would be unfair to hold Caden Pierce to that standard, but I do really think he could be. Maybe we're just overthinking it. And it was like, we literally just got an Ivy League Player of the Year, a Conference Player of the Year, if you want to just kind of go general with it. Of course, he's going to be better than we might think he is. But I guess for mine, I only really thought of one. And this is kind of a cop-out, and I don't know if he's going to be the best player on the team even. But I do think that there's a reality where Luke Ertl comes in, he starts right away, he's that good. And we start looking at future years as instead of 2027, 2028 being the CJ Cox senior year and Jakari senior year, it turns into the Luke Ertl sophomore year. And how good can we be before maybe he ends up going to the draft or something like that? So I think Luke Ertl, of all the incoming freshmen, obviously just given, his background, I think that he could end up being that surprise guy to where when we're going into next season, that's like what we're hanging our hat on and saying, this is why Purdue is going to be super highly ranked going in and could do a lot of damage in the tournament.
I would love to see it. I mean, that's the thing. We've talked about these guys like CJ Cox, Omer Meyer. We're going to talk about Ertl all year, fighting with those guys for minutes. And then we talked about Caden Pierce a lot too. I'm interested, and I know this is your last question. I'm interested to see like who are guys do you think like we don't talk about that are going to be like those guys?
Yeah. Well, there's one guy who we have not mentioned once in this podcast, and it's my answer to this question. It's Jack Benter. I think Jack Benter, realistically, could be starting for this team. I think that you look at what Painter usually does at the 3, and we think of Jack Benner as like a small forward or a power forward based on what he played last year. But on Purdue's official website, he's listed as a guard. So he still fits that 3-guard lineup that
Yeah.
Painter likes to run. But he's 6'6". I mean, that's good enough size for the 3, even if he is playing more of a guard role. And his shooting wasn't fantastic last year, but it wasn't bad. So he kind of fits into that motion shooter type of thing that Painter likes to run at the 3. If you consider like Fletcher a 3 because he was here and CJ the 2. So there's like a little bit of history there where I could see Benter sliding in. And again, last year, Painter trusted Benter as a redshirt freshman. And I feel like that, especially when you're talking about Matt Painter and how usually our teams end up working, it's like the guys that he trusts, and especially if he's trusting them as a freshman, they're probably going to get even more minutes as a sophomore. So I could see Jack Benner at the end of the year being a guy who started every single game. And then realistically, he's a guy where, say he starts every game as a sophomore, he's already started 2 as a freshman. Does he start every game as a junior? Does he start every game as a senior? I mean, are we looking at Jack Benner as a guy who ends up being a 3-year starter at Purdue? And I think that if he does end up taking that leap and he really does solidify himself in that starting lineup, just based on how little I feel like he's getting talked about this offseason compared to the freshmen coming in, and obviously CJ Cox and Daniel Jacobson and Caden Pierce, I think Benter could end up being that guy where we're like, how did we miss him coming out of last year? How did we miss the Brothers Award winner coming out of last year? We should have known he was going to be the guy who stepped up.
I do think it is such a good point that he literally started 2 games last year, like immediately. And of course, it was against not our hardest opponents or anything, but it is such a good point that I can't believe he hasn't been brought up once. Like, we've been talking about Purdue basketball for, I think, 30 minutes at this point, and somehow we mentioned about every other player on the roster besides him, and yet he's probably going to start. Like, it is like a crazy thing to be missing him, and I don't know why that is. I mean, maybe it's just the fact that, you know, he's not one of our main scoring guys. He kind of plays a position that I don't want to say gets lost, but has been the one that gets, I would say, replaced the most and switched over. You know, he's kind of in that same role that Heidi, Colvin were in. I mean, he's in the Gillis role, essentially, again, who was an all-time Purdue guy, but, you know, went in between not starting all the time, switched out, and maybe that's why he kind of gets overlooked, but I think he's a great choice for this. I mean, it's such a good outlook to be like, we went into last season not even probably expecting him to do anything. He's automatically our Brothers Backup of the Year, and then this year, he's Brothers Backup of the Year. We're still acting as if he's some random dude, and there's a chance he could be, you know, I don't want to say he's going to be the guy, but there's a chance he could be, you know, that second or third option.
Yeah, I think looking back at the last couple of years of Purdue basketball really started in that 22-23 season where Braden and Fletcher they're the starters and Edie is obviously the 5. That kind of 2.5, 3 spot, if you count Fletcher at the 2, has always been the question mark. It's been, okay, well, that first year in 22-23, it was Brandon Newman for a while. It was David Jenkins. It was a lot of different guys kind of filling that role. Ethan Morton for a little bit. Then the next year, we brought in Lance Jones, and he kind of solidified that 3rd guard spot. Then we were looking into the next year, and it started rotating again. It started with Jakari, then it was Miles Colvin for a little bit. Then it solidified into CJ. But even going into 25-26, I feel like the answer to this question last year would have been CJ Cox, because we were looking at that offseason, and especially when it was announced that Omer was committing, I feel like most of the projected starting lineups for Purdue, myself included, I was like, oh, well, I mean, Omer's played professionally overseas. He's going to be, you see all the FIBA highlights. You're like, okay, this guy is going to be Braden, Fletcher, Omer, TKR, and Clough, and that's going to be the lineup that we start running. Meanwhile, CJ comes and he wins that starting spot again, and he starts every single game. So I really do think that we're so used to this kind of turnover at that spot where in reality, maybe it's just for the next couple of years, it's solidified and we start seeing more of that turnover at the 5, or we start seeing more of that turnover probably more realistically at the 4, because you're looking at if Caden Pierce is going to start, we're going to have to find a new one starting next season because he only has 1 year of eligibility left. So I think it's just we're so used to that position being up in the air where maybe after this year, we're like, okay, we have a guy there for 2 more years and we need to start looking elsewhere for where Purdue's going to start shuffling around its lineup a little bit.
It's interesting because I feel like it could be a segment on its own, but if you were to go on that, like by the roles and how invested you think, or how consistent it'll be for the next couple years, I think the two, and let's just say CJ Cox is the two, is pretty much locked, I would say, for the next 2 years. I think most people would agree on that. Obviously, things can change, but that's top of the list. And then it probably is the three that is the most realistically locked. Like, I think who starts at the three this year is going to be a starter for probably 3 more years. And then, you go past that, the one is different from the five in the sense that I think the one's going to change because it's Earl and Meyer, and one of them's probably going to get drafted, or one of them's so much better they switch over. It's going to be different than someone at the five where is Jacobson going to be the next one because we don't know what it's going to look like for him. Is Sanan going to be, it's different
Isaiah
levels. I
Hill?
think Isaiah Hill is going to be coming in. Is like, I kind of would be interested in seeing if he can start immediately. And then the four is just, I have no answer for the four. I have no idea what it's going to look like. So it is an interesting point that when we get the roster, I almost want to think like, which of these guys is going to be starting 2 years from now, besides maybe somebody like CJ Cox?
Yeah, actually, we're gonna do that segment. So
Yeah.
we gotta write that
So
down
you get
somewhere.
it,
I mean,
yeah.
that'd be really good. But all right, thank you guys for watching this episode of Wash Boilers. You can follow us on TikTok, Instagram, YouTube, Spotify, and Twitter, all at Wash Boilers. But with that, we'll wrap up. We'll be back on Friday with a new episode. And until then, have a great week.